A pedicle screw, one of the most important implants in many of today's spinal surgeries. But it can also be a vehicle for many deadly infections that affect thousands of Americans each and every year.
I mean, we could have easily lost everything.
Diana Van Winkle has been married to her husband, Mark, for 30 years. In November 2013, 4 months after back surgery, doctors discovered that Mark had a slow-growing infection in his back. An infectious disease specialist was called.
He didn't think that it was airborne because either somebody touched their face or their hair, something went into him, or it could have been from the hardware that they put in. And it was such a slow-growing infection that it took almost the 12 weeks of his FMLA in order to be noticed.
What followed was months of hell, days of the same ritual, hours of having powerful antibiotics pumped into his body.
I didn't leave the house. I mean, I didn't go outside. I basically didn't leave the chair that I lived in for several months.
There is no way to say for sure what caused Van Winkle's illness, but infections are not uncommon after spinal surgeries. A randomized trial of 314 patients released in 2016 by a team of doctors found that 12.7% of patients suffered an infection after a spinal fusion. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, there are 1.2 million back surgeries each year in the United States. The common link? The pedicle screw.
So there is precedented evidence that most orthopedic devices that are being used in the surgery are contaminated.
Those contaminated implants, the researcher believes, are behind many infections. But how can a screw being implanted in a sterile operating room cause this kind of problems?
A small quantity of these devices get used in the surgery. For example, in pedicle screw, a tray has about 120 screws and 6 are used in surgeries. Rest is recycled. They're washed again with the dirty instruments from the theater, from the surgery.
In fact, every time a screw is not used, it gets put back in the sterilizer. The process is repeated for some screws 40 to 50 times. Look at the screw. Look at all the nooks and crannies on it. Now imagine this very screw being washed dozens of times, washed with instruments from surgery, instruments covered in blood and tissue and even DNA. There's a lot of places on this screw where that bacteria can hide. Just so we can be really clear with people, when we're implanting something into their body, some of these screws contain...
So they contain other people's tissue, fat, soap from the process, so it's cross-contaminated.
Now that alarming bit of news was confirmed by orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Vital Shinj. In your opinion, can some of the skin cells, tissue, blood from those implements get transferred onto those screws?
It's highly likely.
So that's a problem, right? I mean...
That's a huge problem.
It is a problem that Aakash Agarwal is determined to fix. He's the director of research for Spinal Balance Inc., which sells prepackaged screws and implant guards. Agarwal led a multi-center study that was released in a number of journals last year, including Global Spine Journal. His study used an electron microscope to examine pedicle screws awaiting implant from surgical trays. Now that study was funded by the government's National Science Foundation, of which Spinal Balance is a paying member.
We randomly selected screws, opened it up, and we found things we should not be finding.
Tissue, fat, corrosion, soap. Now Agarwal's study noted that manufacturers recommend 19 man-hours to sterilize the screws. His team's observation, however, was that a little more than an hour was being used on the process. But there is even another risk of infection, Agarwal believes.
These implants are put in the sterile region, which is called sterile, but it's of course not 100% sterile. There are people in there, flora, patient, so there are bacteria floating in. So they are exposed, they are touched, they are being held, attached to the insertion device, kept on the table until the surgeon is ready to put in the implant into the patient, and during that, these get exposed.
Patrick Shearer of Findlay is in a nursing home, healing from a broken femur and an infection.
Puts a plate and probably, I'm not sure how many screws are in there, somewhere between 10 and 15 screws in the thigh, and then I get another infection. Yeah. So we're fighting that infection, fighting that infection, fighting that infection. It gets into the hip. They have to remove that hip.
Trays of pedicle screws are used in back surgeries, but Dr. Shin says sterilization issues are also likely in trauma surgeries, such as Shearer's.
Like when I do trauma, we do plate and screws. All the screws are in a big tray that are freely mobile.
Meaning that they are sitting out in the open and continually re-washed. So what's the solution?
So to avoid this contamination, you have to provide these devices in a sterile pack, singular sterile packs, so they are not contaminated. So they don't have to be washed again and again. It's ready to be used in surgery. Second mode of contamination, which is touching and exposure in the theater, has to be avoided by enclosing the implant within a guard.
He does not own any of Spinal Balance, and he says the company's products have been developed because of the growing evidence of their need. He believes that infections can be decreased by 60 to 70% by simply guarding the screw. In 2008, Scotland mandated that all medical implants be prepackaged and not be repeatedly sterilized. When asked by 11 investigators why the Food and Drug Administration had not required the same practice in the United States, the agency seemed to indicate in a statement that it did not have the power to address this situation and encouraged hospitals to follow manufacturer guidelines. It is important that sterile devices are sterile prior to implantation. However, FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. Healthcare facilities are responsible for following the device manufacturer's validated instructions for use of pedicle screws and other medical devices, including either reprocessing instructions or instructions that devices are single-use only. But part of the FDA's mission statement says, FDA is responsible for advancing the public health by helping to speed innovations that make medical products more effective, safer. The Van Winkles are frustrated that doctors have said very little about Mark's infection. The lengthy recovery cost Mark his job of 23 years. But they are hopeful that the latest research leads to the implementation of Agarwal's recommendations.
If something so simple could prevent what we had to go through, I think it would be a great thing.